Hello everyone, welcome to an introduction to world building. Today we'll look at an overview of the many facets of the complex and enjoyable art of world building.
What exactly does that entail?
Glad you asked. World building is the process of creating a custom fictional world and filling it with nations, peoples, terrain, languages, cities, history, and more.
Oh my!
And I'm going to show you how to do all that before you leave today.
Today's a day!
It's going to be fun, goofy, and hopefully informative.
Are you not entertained?
World building is a fun, rewarding, and safe way to use your creative energy. Most world builders have it in their minds that a novel, video game, RPG campaign, or some other kind of story will be set in their world. Usually they have a story they want to tell and need a place for it to happen. In some cases, the world comes first and the story will follow. Or maybe you just enjoy world building and do it for fun.
I'm your huckleberry. That's just my game.
Whatever suits you. But since storytelling is almost always a big part of world building, there will be a few comments and tips along the way pertaining to creative writing and storytelling. Now, what I'm about to say is very important, so I'm going to get very close to the camera to make you uncomfortable. Remember as we progress that this is only one method of world building. It's mine! There are countless paths to a finished world, and none of them is necessarily better than any other. If some of my ideas don't work for you, change them. You always have the final say in any decision. This is your world. Don't feel pressured to do something you don't want to do, or to do it in a way that doesn't suit you. You can do what you want, how you want. Anyway, one of the greatest things about creating and using a custom fictional world is that you get to play God.
Phenomenal cosmic power!
For storytellers, this is a huge asset. You get to pick and choose which pieces of reality you want to keep and which pieces get in the way. By having a totally customized universe, you can include things like a geocentric solar system or magic use or lizard people and be above all criticism.
I reject your reality and substitute my own.
Now, as we go through this, don't get discouraged if it takes a while.
Why does everything have to be so difficult?
God created a universe in 6 days, but he's cooler than we are. Don't let the first rough spot you encounter crush your hopes and dreams.
Crush her soul?
Like a grape.
Don't be afraid to spend time on a part if you're stuck. That's what the pause button's for. Mull it over, sleep on it. Ideas are like rough rocks. It takes a lot of tumbling to get them smooth and polished.
Take your time with it. You have all the time you need. All the time in the world.
Being organized is critical. World building is a rabbit hole, and you need to be organized before jumping in. You should always be able to find exactly what you need with minimal fuss. Don't throw 40 untitled papers or text documents into one folder. If you don't take the time to organize your documents, you'll spend more time looking for things you need to reference than you'll spend world building.
And that's really inefficient.
Now allow me to digress for a moment. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was the author of The Hobbit, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, the Silmarillion, a translation and commentary on Beowulf, and a heap of other books. He was one of the fathers of modern fantasy fiction and a master of world building. He worked on his world, Middle-earth, his entire life. He came back to it again and again and put over 50 years of creative energy into his world, its people, its history, and its languages. If ever a high bar in world building was set, this is it. But I think every world builder, novice or experienced, can learn something from this. World building never needs to end. It doesn't have to be just a tool. World building can be either a means to an end or the end in itself. Whichever reason you have for world building, you will hopefully find some helpful tips, hints, and leads for your efforts within this guide. I have this video divided into multiple chapters. If you need to skip to a certain section, here are the times at which each chapter begins. Now let's get started. Okay, this first section will be less than thrilling, but this is important. As I already said in the introduction, organization is key to efficiency, and having the right tools can really help achieve both these goals. I like to use pen and paper when I'm brainstorming. A physical medium feels somehow more free, more conducive to getting my thoughts from my brain to the document. But when it comes time to revise and canonize and archive your work, I would advise against writing with paper and pen if possible. I like using a computer text program like Microsoft Word or OpenOffice to do my writing. And organize your documents. Why?
Because I'll pummel you if you don't.
Putting documents inside folders, inside folders, inside folders, inside a master world building folder will help you keep your writing straightened out and easily accessible. You don't want to swim through one folder filled with all your stuff looking for a certain document. For example, inside my main world building folder, I have one folder titled Nations Info.
And it's got something in it, too.
The folder contains about 7 different Word documents, and each document is dedicated to the culture, history, politics, etc. of one nation in my world.
This is boring!
Each document started out as a basic structure or outline, and then, as I was inspired, I filled in the subheadings with
Words. Words.
Words.
Here's roughly the structure that I followed. Whenever I had an idea for something to add, I would go to that nation's document and add a paragraph or 2 or 3 under the italicized heading that it fit into. If I decided that the citizens of a particular nation primarily wore togas like the ancient Greeks, I would go to the main heading People, start a new paragraph under the subheading Dress, and write a little bit about what they wear and why, the practicality of their clothing, common styles and colors of clothing, what's considered fashionable, and so forth. Notes that don't fit into a particular subheading can go directly under the main heading. And so you go on and on, creating a whole outlined booklet about the one nation. The great thing is it's not cumbersome.
As light as a feather, and as hard as dragon scales.
Because of the outline format of headings and subheadings, it's super easy to find whatever you're looking for. Can't remember who the current king of a certain nation is?
Nope.
Go to the Government, Authority, and Politics section and look under Current Governing Authority. And one nice thing about using a digital medium to write is that you can use your program's search tool to look for a keyword within your paper. You remember something about a guy named Athelstan but can't find where he's mentioned? Use your search tool to look for Athelstan and every occurrence in your document will be highlighted.
That certainly is convenient.
It may very well be that not all of your lands are settled, developed nations, and are instead wilderness areas with only a few native inhabitants. You can still write about these areas using the nation outline, just include less detail. You will probably focus mainly on sections 1 and 2, and mostly ignore sections 3 and 6. If you like this format for breaking down and outlining information about your countries, you can use my system. It's not copyrighted. Oh, and one more thing. Be sure to back up your work on an external storage device occasionally, so hopefully this won't happen to you.
I tried to unplug the computer, but I think I was too late.
It's gone?
But I saved this.
Yeah! Oh no, it's melted! All the pictures and stuff on my computer, all the memory, gone.
How could I have imagined such a horrible series of events? Luckily, none of that actually happened.
At this point, I'm gonna assume you don't have a map of your world. That's alright, because we're gonna make one right now. There are as many different ways to make a fantasy world map as there are people who make them. I'll overview a couple methods here. If you don't play any kind of video game, you can skip ahead to here. One super easy method is to play a game with random world generation, like a game in the Sid Meier's Civilization franchise. This can save a bunch of steps, including shaping continents, placing terrain, founding cities, developing nations, and more. Just play through the game until your whole world is uncovered, then freehand draw the edges of the continents onto a piece of paper or a computer art program. If you like the world it generated, you can copy the locations of deserts, hills, forests, mountains, and so forth. You can also place countries whose borders nearly match those that were generated. If you play Minecraft, you can start a new creative mode world, make a new map, and fly around and fill a wall of maps. Having a 3x3 map wall or larger gives a better representation of the world map than one lone map. For all the video game methods described above, my introduction to world building was actually from a stray Kleenex that found its way into my bored, destructive clutches. I started absent-mindedly tearing it into pieces of various sizes and shapes and letting them fall to the table. When I looked down, the pieces happened to be arranged in such a way that I thought, that kind of looks like a continent. I played around with the pile and rearranged it a bit into a shape that made more sense, and then I saw it. I grabbed a piece of paper and draw the edges of the tissue scraps into a map shape. I drew any exposed table as ocean and blended overlapping tissue edges to be one piece of land. When I was done, my freehand blackline map looked like this. Pretty good for a shredded tissue. This method is like a Rorschach ink blot test. Create an abstract blob and form a continent or two out of the blob. You can do the same thing with paint smears, sand, spilled water, or anything you can scatter into a random blob and then extract a map from it. I like tissues or paper because they more readily form well-defined land masses, and they tend to flutter a bit as they fall, creating increased randomness. If you need help making a believable map, there's dozens of videos about fantasy cartography and map making on YouTube, and there's probably a number of map generation engines or programs on the internet where you just click a button and have a world. I haven't used any of those, but do what works for you. And remember, with any of these methods, you aren't strictly limited to the initial creation and map sketch. You can eliminate, change, or add areas if you think it needs it. Do whatever you need to do to make the map feel right, and go back and change it whenever you need. You have a map now, but it's awfully boring. Terrain features will probably be one of the first things you add to your map.
Good old terra firma.
Just about every book that includes a map of its fictional world will show hills, mountains, forests, swamps, and other features. If you used either of the video game methods we discussed to develop a map, you could simply use the terrain generated by the game. If you don't like the terrain, or you use the tissue/water/ink blot method, you'll need to add your own features. Here are a few of the various biomes and kinds of terrain you may wish to include. This list is by no means exhaustive, and as your world is fictional, you can customize any of these to your heart's content. You probably won't have to go beyond the main headings in the outline. The subheadings are some of the more specific varieties of that general eco-region. Including these is not necessary, but it can add life and more detail to your world. If you wish to add extra realism, you could research the various biomes you want to include and find out where and how and why they exist where they do. Most mountain ranges form on the edge of tectonic plates, so if two land masses seem like they could have been separate then run together, you could put a mountain range along there. Deserts and other dry places are frequently found in the shadow of large mountains, in the center or western regions of a large landmass, or on coasts near cold surface currents. Freshwater marshes are usually low elevation and not very close to a river or coast.
Festering, stinking marshland as far as the eye can see.
The kind of forest present depends on latitude, altitude, and moisture. Trees closer to the equator or nearer water will usually be broad-leafed canopy trees, while trees closer to the poles or high in the mountains will usually be evergreens. Now this ties into a quick distinction I'd like to make. We've been talking so far about what I call macro geography. This is your world map, your geopolitical scene, your mountain ranges, and general ecoregions. This is what we generally spend time on as world builders, and it's fun. But for the storytellers among us, you must also consider microgeography. This is a term I use for detailed, immersive descriptions of particular areas. A world map is great and all, but to make your audience really believe in and feel like they're a part of your world, you have to spend time developing a strong sense of place through vivid descriptions. Which feels more alive and engaging, this or this? Use the biomes and ecosystems you build into your world as a reference, then research those areas and get acquainted with their flora and fauna, their topography and weather patterns. Use your research and experience to build engaging descriptions that truly immerse the audience in your world. Anyway, this is by no means a be-all, end-all guide to climates and biomes. Do some real research. This is just a generalized summary. Of course, the alternative to doing research is to just tell your critics, "The universe is mine to command, to control!" That's the point of fiction. It's fiction. I would like to quickly mention the addition of original plants and creatures to your world and how that affects the feel of your world. I'm not a super imaginative person. I have a hard time inventing new creatures, so I don't really have any specific tips, and I won't spend a lot of time on this. What I would like to say is that world building is very much a spectrum of creativity. Tolkien, for example, added a number of fictional monsters to Middle-earth, totally inventing the concept of orcs and balrogs. He also invented a number of flowers like Nifredil and Simbelmine. But on the animal front, there's not much. L. Frank Baum's Oz series is one of the most imaginative pieces of literature I've ever met. There are totally new and often bizarre creatures at every turn, like flat-headed people that carry their brains in cans. The point I'm trying to make is, how foreign and bizarre and curious do you want your world to be? Do you want to make Earth Plus, or do you really want to drive home that your audience isn't in Kansas anymore? Well-developed maps, world history, and geopolitical interactions will ground your audience and make the world seem more factual. Adding a broadcast of fantastical monsters, animals, and plants will tend to strongly push your work towards the more imaginative end of the spectrum. I would hazard a guess that for a lot of people, if this is Earth, they don't want to make modded Earth. They want something totally different. It really comes down to what you want your audience to think and feel regarding your world.
Time! The time! Who's got the time?
Now we need to decide what era your world is in. Your world doesn't have to mesh perfectly with Earth's timeline of scientific and cultural development, but choosing a time period can be a good baseline and starting point for many things. If you're not sure how to answer, ask this question: what's the current state of the military technology? A sad truth about humanity is that as we become more technologically advanced, we decide we need to use that new knowledge to wage war more effectively. But you can use this to date your world. Use the commonly available weapon and armor technology to decide where your timeline stands. And of course, there can be overlap. It's okay to be in the Middle Ages but have a prototype musket show up. The arms race and the secret weapon are not new concepts.
But the humans won't stop there. They'll make bigger boards and bigger nails. Soon they will make a board with a nail so big it will destroy them all.
What you should look at here is what the average warrior would go to battle with. If your typical guy goes to his local weapons shop, what's going to be the most common thing there?
Plates, helmets, pretty much anything to suit your needs.
I should mention that technology evolves at very different rates depending on a huge number of factors. While the Europeans were feeding emerald powder to plague victims, the Arabs were performing successful surgery, and when the British showed up in America toting muskets and field cannons, the Native Americans hadn't got past the bow and arrow. Technology has no linear correlation to how many millennia have passed. There are isolated people today who still hunt with blowguns and use bone tools, while other people have never had to do more work for their food than ordering a hamburger on their phone. Anyway, here's a rough and ready outline of Earth's rate of technological development, at least in Europe. My apologies, I'm just more familiar with European history than anywhere else. Spears, clubs, slings, and thick hide shirts belong to prehistory times. The ancient era was home to swords, bows, horsemen, studded leather armor, early metal armors, and the first wooden warships. The Middle Ages saw the advent of the knight, better plate mail, castles, siege weapons, and large warships. The Renaissance brought in gunpowder and saw crossbows, cannons, muskets, and frigates, an even larger kind of warship with mounted cannons. Rifles, handguns, early synthetic armors, early aircraft, and metal warships started being produced in early modern times. And now we have weapons like machine guns, jet bombers, tanks, nuclear submarines, and intercontinental ballistic missiles. And according to popular opinion and prediction, the future will hold weapons like laser guns, space jets, plasma grenades, and energy shields. The time frames that offer the most flexibility for creative experimentation are probably anything before the Renaissance and the future. Of course, any epoch can be as creative as you want if your whole world is custom made. You could have a total parallel universe to the modern world, but if you want to play around with Earth-based historical fiction, you can more easily avoid anachronistic complications if you set the story in prehistory, ancient, medieval, or future times.
How do we know it's an ice age? Because of all the ice!
It should be obvious, you'll want to keep the era pretty consistent throughout your world. It's fine if one nation is technologically a bit more advanced than its neighbors, but overall it should be about the same. One other thing I want to mention is, what kind of measurement system does your world have? It's easiest and totally acceptable to just use a real-world system of measures, but you could design your own. Be warned, having a unique system of measures can make it difficult for storytellers to work with. If you decide to have an original system, what it's like will depend on the world age. Newer worlds will have standardized, probably base 10 measurements like the metric system. Older worlds will probably measure things by human measures, the length of an arm, the width of a thumb, and so forth. Oh, and in case it's not obvious, I suppose I should mention most of my world-building experiences in the high fantasy genre with a world set in approximately the Middle Ages. You know, swords and armor and dragons and wizards and necromancers and magical artifacts and all that good stuff. Most of my examples will be geared towards this kind of world. I don't have as much experience with urban fantasy or sci-fi settings. I'm not generally a huge fan of those genres, but I'll try to include some sci-fi oriented tips for those of you that like this and want to build that kind of world. Hopefully everyone can gain at least something from this. Establishing the dividing lines between nations is an essential part of nearly every world-building job, unless your whole world is under one ruler or perhaps there are no distinct nations at all.
A world without rules and controls, without borders or boundaries.
If this is the case for you, don't go away.
I'm watching you. Yeah, don't fall asleep. No, don't move. I'm watching you.
Be aware that borders often change over time. Depending on what era your world is in, borders will be shaped differently. A sign of modern times is drawing straight borders. There were no straight borders in ancient times before the development of latitude and longitude measurement. Borders were often drawn along rivers, mountain ranges, and other natural obstacles and barriers. Therefore, feel free to have straight lines and square corners in post-Renaissance times, but more ragged, erratic, natural lines are better for older times. Keep in mind, you may not want to mark all borders in older worlds, especially if an obvious natural barrier divides them. Many times borders were fuzzy and generalized and were only clearly established in cases of frequent confusion or hostility. In Middle-earth, the border between Gondor and Mordor is marked by the Ephel Duath, the Mountains of Shadow, and the Shire is bounded by the Brandywine River on the east and the Far Downs in the west. No extra borders are needed. These natural markers are clear enough. Very often, borderlands were contested anyway, so the best and cleanest option may be to write the name of the nation in the general area of its control and leave it at that. Remember, as you're drawing borders and adding nations, that history is filled with war, and one of the primary reasons for that is often territorial gain. Rulers who are contented with what they have are few and far between. So countries constantly try to gain chunks of the best land at their opponent's expense. Assume that every nation will constantly be trying to take little bits of its neighbors' lands for itself and will frequently be stopped only by full combat. Your nations will be located and shaped differently depending on a number of factors, including your world era, the existence of fantasy races, and whether you care about detail and realism.
I'm a mammal that cares.
In older times, nations were tiny. And the larger nations were almost always composed of dozens of small, semi-independent principalities, dukedoms, and fiefs. Before the days of cell phones and modern means of transportation, communication was significantly slower and more difficult.
We haven't heard anything. We've been gold.
This made the prospect of ruling, and especially defending, a huge empire rather difficult. Nonetheless, it was always the grand dream of any medieval king to conquer and unify the little clans and counties around his realm. Generally, older worlds frequently have smaller, more fragmented nations, while worlds in a more modern setting usually have fewer, larger nations. When you're deciding where to draw borders and how to define a nation, one common and easy way is to define a nation by a contiguous section of similar terrain. This map illustrates this well. All of Latium is green plains, all of Altus is hills and mountains, all of Silvumbria is forest. This method works really well when you have fantasy races or specialized humans that are uniquely suited to life in those kinds of conditions. As a fairly recent example of books that use this system, look at the Wings of Fire series by Tweety T. Sutherland. The various races of dragons in these books all have a kingdom composed of the kind of land they thrive in. The desert belongs to the Sandwings, the marshes belong to the Mudwings, and so forth. The system of defining a nation by one kind of terrain works well in the context of fantasy races because they are frequently specialized for a certain kind of terrain. The Ice Wings wouldn't do well in the tropical forest of the Rain Wings, and none but the Sea Wings could live in the ocean. However, when you apply this system to kingdoms and nations of humans, it can feel a bit cheap and lazy. Humans just don't do that. The terrain of the real world is too detailed and varied to allow such a blanket statement. Most well-built worlds have detailed maps and nations that include various parts of this detail. Look at Tolkien's maps of Middle-earth. They're crammed with streams, patches of woods, lone mountain peaks, plains, highlands, and so forth. You can't define any of his nations by terrain. In many cases, it's better to have detailed terrain and place nations which encompass a variety of landscapes. Don't think, here's a patch of desert. I'll put an Arabian-themed country here and define its borders as being the edge of the desert. Look, nations need diversity, and not just for tourism, but for natural resources as well. Is your desert country really going to leave the bordering nation of lush fields alone and not try to take a bite out of their land just because, oh, we're desert people?
Inconceivable!
Is your tundra nation going to ignore the nearby valley of trees and hot springs for the sake of maintaining a consistently climate-based border?
That's ridiculous.
Countries will try to conquer whatever lands profit them. It would probably be simpler for the desert nation to conquer the farming community than to start a massive irrigation project enabled by 1,000 miles of aqueduct. Think realistically. Ask yourself, what lands nearby would this nation want? What neighboring areas would give this country the most profit?
Half the Fourth Kingdom, but it's huge.
If multiple nations have an equal desire for the same patch of land, which has greater military power for an all-out conquest or defense of that land? If a nation is primarily defined by terrain, there should be a good reason. Maybe the people stuck in the desert have tried to expand, but they've never been able to muster a strong enough army. Whoever has the better military will usually have the final say in a land's ownership.
Spoils, worthy of such a noble...
As long as we're discussing military action, I would like to bring up the Mellen's outline of combat variables. Now, I have no military experience, but through my studies of world history, I've determined 6 primary variables that affect the outcome of a battle. These are morale, experience, leadership, equipment, numbers, and strategy. These factors themselves depend on universal factors like weather and terrain, and some combinations will be better than others in certain situations. Legions of well-equipped soldiers could be easily defeated by a small band of elite guerrillas with excellent strategy and a terrain advantage.
Hannibal placed his spearmen and slingers at the front. Behind them, his swordsmen flanked by cavalry. When the Romans attacked, Hannibal's swordsmen retreated. To the Romans, that seemed to be due to their force, but in reality, Hannibal had ordered the retreat. As the Romans continued to drive the swordsmen back, Hannibal's cavalry galloped in from behind. Once the attacking pincers connected, the Romans were completely surrounded.
Just keep these things in mind when writing about battles or combat or world building the history of war between certain nations. As you can see in this map, only the locations of the nation's capitals are labeled. You can add as many cities, towns, and villages as you want. When placing a city, there are 5 things to consider: trade, defense, water, food, and health. The capital of a nation is often the trading hub of the area. For a good example of this, look at Panem in the nation of Latium. It's situated on the fork of the North and Panem rivers, which act as aquatic trade routes to allow merchants to easily penetrate the nation. It also gives them access to the Central Sea, and now Seraphet is just a sail, oar, and eastern wind away. In addition, small settlements often appear along trade routes between larger cities, which themselves often expand rapidly. A nation's capital needs to be well fortified. The capital is often the seat of government, so if a nation's capital is conquered, the rest will likely soon follow. For this example, look at Caer. It's situated on the cliffs of the snowy Muniatis Mountains, which strongly protects the city from invasion. On top of that, prospective invaders would have to go through the tundra and Morgulhorn steppe, or sail all the way through the cold sea to attack from the north. Caer doesn't sound like a very fun place to live, but good luck conquering it. Maybe the main settlement of a galactic empire is surrounded by anti-spaceship laser guns or tractor beams or an energy shield dome. Or maybe your elven city has a magical wall that burns up their enemies. Fortification can also lie in concealment. It's really hard to conquer a city that you can't find. So a nation of stealthy forest dwellers could have a capital with no fortifications at all, but it's really well camouflaged and hidden away. The lifeblood of a city is its citizens, and the lifeblood of any citizen is water in plenty. Rivers, wells, lakes, and reservoirs are the more common sources found in an older world age. In a futuristic world, perhaps they melt huge amounts of snow or liquefy glaciers. Maybe they have large-scale desalination plants or have enormous dehumidifiers to take the water out of the air. Or maybe the people in your world, like desert animals, don't even need much water at all, or do they get all their water from their food?
Food!
Do you like to eat?
I have a substantial appetite. Born to gorge. That's me.
Food is just as important as water. Your city's location will greatly affect the kinds and quantity of food available. Coastal cities will probably live off of seafood.
You are a fishmonger. Not I, my lord.
And I would you were so honest a man.
People in a stable climate with good soil and good weather will probably raise large quantities of grains, vegetables, and fruit.
These radishes are beautiful. I'll give them 9 out of 10.
People in dryish, hilly terrain might live largely off of grazing livestock.
Just meat.
And in any place where cattle are prevalent, don't forget about dairy.
I eat all the cheese. I eat all of the cheese.
People in just about every climate fed scraps to poultry and pigs.
There's a pig, pig.
Some food sources in a marshy area could include rice, poultry, fish, and cattails. If you have a nation of dwarves or goblins or an underground human settlement, they probably gain most of their food through trading. But maybe they found a way to subsist on mushrooms or farm fish in an underground lake.
Fish, so juicy, sweet.
A nation in a huge forest will likely live mostly on hunting and foraging. What if they have farms of nut trees or domesticated deer? In a futuristic setting, what if science has progressed to the point that genetic modification allows people to photosynthesize?
Photosynthesis produces 4 times as much glucose as a human body can consume. That's obviously bad, but also interesting. It meant I needed to figure out a way for these photosynthetic people to sequester or expel excess glucose and therefore avoid the curse of space diabetes.
Are normal crops raised in giant domes, or is this alien planet friendly enough to support plant life without an artificial climate control system?
Possible.
Plants, water.
Halo ring? I don't put anything past it.
Is there a super pill that's packed with nutrients and cover your food needs for the day? If so, how common or cheap are these pills, and are they a long-term solution?
What, may I ask, is this?
That's a dehydrated ionized protein tablet, configured for lasagna flavor. All food is now capsulized for maximum nutritional value. This is a bacon, lettuce, and tomato on whole wheat toast. Could have used a little mayo, but good.
Humans are disgusting.
Nobody wants to live in a stale, musty cesspit swarming with insects and disease. Make sure your city is in a sanitary, healthy location.
Well, the king said it was daft to build a castle on the swamp, but I built it all the same, just to show them. It sank into the swamp, so I built a second one. That sank into the swamp. So I built a third one. That burned down, fell over, then sank into the swamp, but the fourth one stayed up.
Roman cities were often founded on flat but gently sloping ground in windy areas. Wastewater would run downhill in the Roman sewers, and the ventilation would help keep the city smelling fresh and clean. If you have a futuristic world, maybe they don't need sanitation or have found a way to atomize waste. If you have a customized race of people, maybe they don't even produce waste. Naming places can be a challenge. I sometimes sit for 10 or 15 minutes staring vacantly at my computer screen until I decide on a name for a particularly stubborn river. Don't be disheartened if it takes a while.
Everything sucks. It really sucks. Everything sucks now. I freaking hate my life.
You can always come back to it later. But to help you along, I've compiled 5 methods that can really help if you're stuck on what to call a place. If you're at least partly multilingual, inventing foreign-sounding names can be much easier. If you speak Latin, for example, you can simply take an adjective describing the location, find the Latin root, and tack on, say, the plural genitive ending of the second case masculine.
Slabba habba twing bing noogie alba bingo.
Okay, Brother 3PO, what did Sister Jane say?
Nothing.
What?
Yeah, what are you talking about? I said a bunch of stuff.
Well, you did make sounds, but I'm afraid those sounds were just randomly assembled bits of gibberish and don't belong to any actual language.
Or you can derive names from translated words in a relatively obscure language like Faroese or Telugu. Need a name for a god of war? Take the Icelandic word for battle, Bardaga, chop off the A and call him Bardag.
That felt like Hebrew. That was Hebrew, right?
No, just Middle Eastern sounding gibberish.
How about a newly discovered mountain range? Take the Latin word for new, novus, give it the plural accusative ending of the second case masculine, and call them the Novos Mountains.
French sounding gibberish.
Rubio, Mavia, pasta primavera.
That was half gibberish, half just listing menu items from an Italian restaurant.
Of course, the language you base the names off of will reflect its inherent sound. If your world has a primarily Nordic culture, names like Sturrisborg and Vatnsbeien are fitting. If you want a more Mediterranean or Roman culture, town names like Opidum Valley and Flumene are more fitting.
Yo tengo tres bigotes en mis piscinas. Hey, that was Spanish, right?
Yes. You just said, I have 3 mustaches in my swimming pools. Did the Holy Spirit directly reveal to you that you have 3 mustaches in your swimming pools, or did you just subconsciously shout out the only words you remember from Senorita Van Meter's 5th period Spanish class your freshman year of high school?
Choose a source language that comes from a real-world country whose culture is similar to that particular area of your world. Another way is to pick an adjective describing the location and choose an obscure synonym, then rearrange the letters in a random order.
Wanna come with me and Allison to play anagrams?
We take proper names and rearrange the letters to form a description of that person.
My cat's breath smells like cat food.
One example of this that I made was in naming a large swamp. I chose the word quagmire, rearranged it to say Reimgauch, and altered the spelling to make Reimgach. Another example was my creation of a bustling trade town. I thought, what's one way that a city could make a profit by encouraging trade in itself?
Taxes! Taxes! Beautiful, lovely taxes!
And I thought by charging tariffs. I rearranged tariffs into serift and turned that into serifet. One method of naming is to describe the location via the name.
The cliffs of insanity!
If there's a town on the border between a swamp and a forest, call it Fenwood.
The fire swamp.
How about Oakdale for a small, peaceful forest village?
The thieves' forest.
If a small town is on a strip of land between 2 lakes, you could call it Waterville. Another option for naming locations is to wait until you've developed some of the lore and history of the world and simply name the place after what they're famous for. A clump of mountains that produces a lot of iron ore can be called the Black Mountains. The Barrier Mountains can separate 2 hostile countries. If a strip of mountains prevents the desert from creeping into your fertile country, how about calling it the Guardian Range?
You are Guardian!
Another way that I personally don't often use, if you're good at inventing history and lore for your world, is to name places after fictional characters of the past. Historical figures, saints, a past or current ruler, or the settler of the town.
The most famousest of hobbits.
Real examples from the USA include Alexandria, Virginia, San Antonio, Texas, Lincoln, Nebraska, and St. Paul, Minnesota. So now you have the names, borders, and cities of a few countries, but what about the countries themselves? What are their culture, politics, people, military, and sciences like? One common way for world builders to tackle this is to base their nations largely off of real-world countries or established fantasy archetypes. You can have the British nation, the Arabian nation, the ancient Roman nation, the Viking nation, the Asian nation, the Tolkienish Elven nation, and so forth. And this is a fine way to do it, but in my opinion, you get bonus points if your national cultures are mostly original. And originality can certainly be achieved by having a heavy blend of pre-existing cultures to come up with something new. Maybe you have a nation on a coastal desert whose people build lots of roads, love tea, and send archers on longships to raid nearby villages. Be aware that terrain tends to shape the people as they adapt to their surroundings. There's a reason that Arabian cultures are depicted as being nomadic tent dwellers who ride camels and wear those neck curtain things. So don't feel bad about using a real nation as a springboard and inspiration for a similarly situated nation of yours. The climate and majority kind of terrain will affect many variables about the physical nature of the country. These include how places are named, what the cities look like, what resources the country produces, what the people look like, what kinds of clothes they wear, and what kinds of jobs are available. There are many other important cultural elements that have somewhat less of a physical cause. These would be factors like what the typical family is like, whether they do much international trade or whether the citizens mostly trade with themselves, how militaristic they are, how much emphasis they place on fine arts, science, and law, how religious they are.
Oh, mighty twig, you are powerful and twig-like.
What the governmental system is like, and how much infrastructure they build.
All right, but apart from the sanitation, the medicine, education, wine, public order, irrigation, roads, a fresh water system, and public health, what have the Romans ever done for us?
Now, I should say that for how much people tend to talk about culture, it's a pretty nebulous concept in most people's minds. I'd like to help make it a bit more concrete. There are some specific factors you should really consider when world building a nation or people group. What do they assume to be common knowledge, but outsiders don't know? Especially consider their mythological and historical traditions, the stories that are passed down through the generations. What do they consider normal that shocks or offends others? Similarly, what do others consider normal that shocks or offends them? What unique social conventions, codes of conduct, ceremonies, or rituals do they have? What do they do that they consider normal but might look silly or strange to an outsider? And what slang terms, unique vocabulary, or idioms do they use, and what caused them to develop those words or speech patterns? One subtle, underappreciated aspect of culture that can do wonders for your world building is to ask, what do these people hold dear, and what are they afraid of?
I fear neither death nor pain.
What do you fear, my lady?
A cage. To stay behind bars until use and old age accept them. And all chance of valor has gone beyond recall or desire.
Right now! Right! Right for ruin! And the world's ending!
Take the time to figure out what each culture loves and what they hate, what they respect and what they despise. If you do, history and lore practically write themselves. Look for conflicts between different cultures' values. Disagreement over values can cause tension and conflict between nations, and conflict is one of the fundamentals of storytelling. This can be the foundation of centuries-old feuds, lingering resentment, and prejudices between nations and between characters from different nations. This has a higher ratio of inspiration and depth gained to effort expended than almost any other single world-building activity. Okay, that's all what I would call relational culture. These are the things that are going to reflect in the actions, beliefs, and perspectives of the members of a particular culture and are especially important for storytellers to consider. But there's another branch of culture that I would call legacy culture. Wrong legacy. This is closely related to how prosperous and peaceful a nation is. When a society has peace and leisure, when they no longer need to spend all their time trying to just survive, they can develop this legacy culture. This includes things like literature, art, music, philosophy, worship practices, science, and a system of formal education. These all contribute to a society's legacy. Ask yourself, what does this society give to the world, and what do they leave behind them? Legacy culture will be found primarily in cultures that have writing technologies, and oral culture is not easily preserved or disseminated throughout the world. Consider the philosophies of Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato, the literature and drama of Homer, Aeschylus, and Sophocles, the sciences of Archimedes, Hippocrates, Pythagoras, Ptolemy, and Democritus, the Parthenon, the Acropolis, the Temple of Athena at Delphi, red figure kylixes, and illustrated urns. These are all distinct, familiar parts of ancient Greek culture. These are the kinds of things that comprise legacy culture. Generally speaking, relational culture will be more relevant when you are writing about cultures that still exist, and especially if you are, say, writing a story about a fellowship of characters who come from or have to travel through different places. Legacy culture will be more prominent when you're discussing ancient or distant cultures, or when storytelling and creative writing isn't really why you're world building. Now, throughout your development of culture, I have one major warning. Beware of the planet of hats.
You can't be a cowboy without a hat.
Without a hat?
Planet of Hats is the name for when an entire society and every member of it is defined by one particular quirk. It's like saying that every member of your British-themed nation loves tea, old books, and classical music.
Cheerio!
Or that every member of your Greek nation loves philosophy and oratory and wears an olive wreath. Now, this is fine to a limited extent. The whole point of society and culture is to provide a familiar banner of customs and beliefs for the citizenry to unite around.
Why are you giving an outsider 10 out of 10?
But people are individuals and will have individual preferences and beliefs.
You will be assimilated.
It's too unrealistic to say that literally every member of your Viking nation wears a horned helmet and goes pillaging. The reason we don't hear about the occasional pacifist Viking in real history is that they died in obscurity, or their records were destroyed, or they were kicked out of the community for being different. In addition to this, individuals will have different degrees of enthusiasm for certain parts of their nation's culture. Baseball is considered by many to be the definitive American sport, but does every American go nuts over baseball? No. Some people don't care about it at all. Some people like it okay and will watch it on TV, and some people insist on watching every game. People don't have to be all for or all against a custom. They frequently fall somewhere in the middle. However, you very rarely find someone who is militantly anti-baseball and thinks baseball is ruining our country, it should be abolished.
It's not like there are people that are anti-whale anyway. You know, it's like, oh, don't bring up whales around my dad, he'll go off.
It's a national pastime, and we as a nation respect that, even if not everyone loves it or has a deep team loyalty. Okay, that tangent was mostly something for storytellers to keep in mind. When you're filling out your nation outlines, you don't really have to worry about this. The information and customs in your outlines should be from the perspective of an outsider looking at the population as a whole.
Revenge is not an idea we promote on my planet.
Before we move on, I'd like to take a second to look at a few kinds of fantasy races you may wish to include. Even if they're not the main occupants of a nation, keep them in mind as various kinds of creatures or monsters your characters may meet. Remember that these are only established trends and you can change them however you want. Elves are typically either magical, elegant, fair woods people who are excellent archers, or they bake cookies in a tree, or they're Santa's little helpers. Dwarves are short, stocky, bearded warriors who are excellent miners and metal workers and who favor the axe as a weapon of war. Wizards are sometimes classified as being their own race. They frequently wear robes, have long flowing beards, wide-brimmed hats, a staff, and of course the ability to use magic to some extent. There are a few variants of the evil wizard. There's the evil sorcerer, who's basically just a mirror image of the wizard. Then there's the necromancer, the one who practices dark magic to reanimate legions of undead for his army. There's also the lich, who stores his soul or life energy in a hidden object so he can't be killed. The sorceress archetype can be either good or evil. The good sorceress is a beautiful, graceful lady with magical powers and wisdom. The evil sorceress is often just as beautiful, but uses her appearance and powers for evil purposes. Witches are ugly old crones who live in swamps and boil vats of suspicious green liquid in cauldrons. They can fall just about anywhere on the danger scale. The modern view of demons in fantasy fiction is that they're dangerous evil spirits who, when they take a physical form, often appear as hideous monsters or ugly bat-winged people. Being spirits, they can sometimes only be defeated or banished with magic or a holy artifact, and in some cases they can possess living things.
You just said Satan is my homeboy in Latin. Backwards. Which I think means you have a demon.
I do not have a demon.
You probably have a demon.
I do not have a demon.
Pretty sure you have a demon.
We do not have a demon.
Yeah, pretty sure you got a demon there, Daryl.
On the flip side of this, you have angels. When featured in fantasy fiction, they're usually shown as holy spirit warriors with white robes, wings, and assorted weaponry. Dryads and naiads are spirits of trees and water. Whether they're good, bad, or morally neutral is up to you. Many times they only care about protecting their native forest or waterway and are only a problem for intruders. Fairies are usually tiny, winged people with some degree of magical powers who live in wild places and can be good, evil, mischievous, or anything in between.
It's my turn to be naughty.
Wait, what do you mean be naughty?
Orcs are generally big, ugly brutes who have no particular talents other than being an average foot soldier. They're usually on the evil side, but somehow not always. Goblins are like lesser orcs. They're usually only a danger in large groups. The lone goblin often exists for a first challenge to your level 1 warrior or as cannon fodder for more experienced soldiers. If goblins are downgraded orcs, then trolls are upgraded orcs. Most of the time. I've seen trolls range from this to this. To this.
And I am Bluebell the Troll, terrified throughout the 9 kingdoms.
Trolls can be whatever you want them to be, but they're almost always an enemy.
Zombies. The undead.
Zombies are reanimated corpses who are often under the command of a necromancer. There are a couple views of zombies. There's the slow, moaning, infectious zombie who attacks primarily by biting.
Roaming the earth, hunting for brains.
And then there's the undead guardian of underground crypts, who's a challenge just because it's an undead warrior. In some cases, zombies can only be killed by decapitation or holy magic. Skeletons are kind of like zombies in that they often serve a necromancer, and most physical attacks won't kill them. Hitting them with a bludgeoning weapon or light magic tends to knock them to pieces and dispose of them. Vampires are evil, blood-sucking creatures of the night who can infect others into vampirism. Stabbing through the heart is often the only physical means of killing them. They're usually considered to be attractive, but they can't survive in sunlight or a holy presence.
My name is Edward, and sunlight doesn't kill me, it just makes me sparkle, but I self-identify as a vampire.
No, we do not accept you.
What is it? Dragons?
Dragons can be just about whatever you want them to be. In most Western literature and mythology, they're huge winged reptiles who breathe fire and hoard gold. In Western culture, they've been considered for thousands of years to be a supreme power of evil, greed, and cunning who kill and steal for no particular reason. That's started to change in recent years, and now dragons are frequently pictured as having certain good qualities. Maybe they're just misunderstood, maybe they've always been on the good side, whatever. Dragons are more of a category than a single kind of creature. They're very versatile, and you won't really get called out for being creative with these guys. Looking quick at sci-fi settings, cyborgs are usually robotically augmented humans. Whether this augmentation is an optional upgrade for people to have is up to you. Sometimes this is necessary to allow human life in harsh conditions, and sometimes it's done to increase a person's combat capabilities.
You have a machine to tie your shoes?
Robots can take just about any shape, degree of intelligence, or level of danger. A common form is the android, a humanoid robot with some level of artificial intelligence. Machines can be difficult to combat with ordinary weapons, so an explosion or an EMP is often needed to defeat an army of robots. There are as many different depictions of aliens as there are references to them, but they frequently take a reptilian, amphibian, or insectoid form. Sometimes they're just scaly humanoids. They can be anywhere on the danger scale from "we come in peace" to "cower, puny earthlings." Sindarin. Dovazul. Parseltongue. Klingon.
That's not gibberish, it's Klingon.
How are they related? They're all constructed languages.
I am fluent in over 6 million forms of communication.
They were designed and invented by authors, screenplay writers, game developers, and philologists to add another layer of depth to a fictional world, or to provide a real-life alternative to the absurdities of modern languages like English. What kid hasn't invented a code language to share with a friend, or at least made a code alphabet? Developing your own language can be as simple or complex as you want it to be, but very rewarding in any case. Like anything with world building, the time and effort you put into this is entirely up to you. If you want, you could retain basic English grammar and just substitute English vocabulary for a few pieces of gibberish. If you wanted to go really in-depth, you could develop a whole grammatical system. That's what I did. My language has a totally different grammatical structure from English. I've been working on it for over 3 years now. I have a summary guide of grammar rules that's 72 pages long, a customized alphabet of 41 runes, and a vocabulary of over 630 words.
I'm a genius!
And the vocabulary is ever growing.
When
This is too long.
Okay, I'm done, but I love creating my own language. I'm very linguistically minded, so I spend a lot of time on this. You don't have to if you don't want to. All you need for a custom language is a pile of gibberish words that you can substitute for English words.
Again, you're not speaking French!
Grab a notebook with some lined paper and draw a line down the middle of the page. Write a heap of wacky words on one side, and as you run into the need for a new word, just pick one of your gibberish words and write your needed English word on the other side of the column. If you're writing a conversation between two characters in the other language, write the conversation in English first. Substitute any words that you've already added to your language notebook and define new words for ones that haven't been used yet. There's no need to develop a whole dictionary of words that you'll never use in your story. My eventual goal is to have an entire dictionary of words, definitions, examples, etymology, spelling, and more.
He's crazy.
If you really want to have deep, rich lore in your world, you could do the same, but it's totally up to you. One quick note about inventing gibberish words. The inherent sounds of the words will reflect on its native users. Very few people think about the way their native language actually sounds. Words with lots of consonants, guttural sounds, and glottal stops like ngafrak kvadzur seems like it would fit best with a harsh-tongued race like orcs. An Elvish-style language seems like it would use lots of vowels and few throaty noises and be more graceful and flowing like Iolina la Elomohan. And a culture of really silly, over-the-top gestures could have words like freebie-deebie lama-ding-dong. The sound of your language can be manipulated to convey a certain image about its users and portray them in a positive or negative light. Including a variety of words that have very different sounds can prevent this if you don't want this effect.
Chrome, chrome, chrome.
This one is very strongly up to personal preference. Many fantasy worlds never address the issue of the spiritual realm, deities, gods, or religious practices. A sizable chunk of the Silmarillion, Tolkien's Book of Middle-earth canon, is devoted to explaining the Valar and the Maiar, different levels of gods and spirits. As far as I know, this lore was never really brought up in The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings, so that maybe half a dozen people besides me who have read the Silmarillion are the only ones to know about this. But it can be kind of fun to create a religion for your world.
At least I believe in something these days.
Naturally, some gods are going to be more commonly worshipped in some nations and cultures than in others because of what the people hold to be important. I added a pantheon loosely based on the ancient Greek and Nordic pantheons. I have one chief god, Daon, who created the world and the other gods, or Yspridae. The Yspridae I added are Ostracon, god of the sky, Haskamine, god of the earth, Lumene, goddess of seas, Lenehild, goddess of wild plants and forests, Elenil, goddess of wildlife, Avahain, goddess of the perpetuation of the species, Eramas, goddess of horticulture, harvest, and the homestead, Athuin, god of craftsmanship, Bisahel, goddess of the fine arts, Bothakav, god of animal husbandry, Yania, goddess of trade, commerce, and justice.
Any jury can be swayed. All you need is a...
And Soratur, god of protection and justified war. There was also one powerful deity who rejected the calling of the Yspridae to be governors and stewards of the world, and is the primary motivator behind the forces of destruction, chaos, death, and decay. Of course, your religion doesn't have to be a polytheistic pantheon. However, using the format of lots of lesser gods allows for some really fun distinctions between cultures and maybe some interesting story elements. And if you want to include interaction with gods in a story, the system works well. With a monotheistic religion, a meeting with the one supreme god of everything could be really interesting, but the character of this god will probably be foggy, and his thoughts, motivations, and desires will most likely be pretty inscrutable.
So in conclusion, God is a circle full of book and rainbows. Wait 1 sec. Are you telling me God is a reading rainbow? A reading rainbow! Oh my god, my childhood just got so much more theologically significant.
Whereas with a dozen or so lesser gods, there can be a lot more familiar and more comfortable to deal with. They seem more human, so it could be easier to, say, carry a dialogue and to include them in the events of the story. The Iliad is a perfect example of this. This 3,000-year-old epic poem about the Trojan War portrays the Greek gods as being more like humans with superpowers and not wholly exalted deities. The gods participate in battles, make mistakes, get injured, miraculously save their favorite humans, and so forth. By having a larger number of less powerful gods, you can more easily add interesting character interactions.
I'm history! No, I'm mythology! Nah, I don't care what I am! I'm free!
Creating and compiling the history of your world is probably one of the more difficult tasks in the whole process of world building. By now, your world should be well developed in terms of geography and nations and language and whatnot, but you really should have some history.
I read about it in Hogwarts. A history.
And in addition to having a more interesting setting, if you're writing a story, you can gain ideas for new events and parts of the plot from the world's history.
The scrolls don't tell the future. They only guide us with the knowledge of the past.
90% of Tolkien's Silmarillion is the chronicle of events in Middle-earth and Valinor since the creation of the world. The remainder is timelines, maps, and genealogical charts. This book is around 350 pages of solid world building. When I say you need history, I don't mean you need to write your own Silmarillion. You should just at least have a few major events in your archives.
Let me explain. No, there is too much. Let me sum up.
Give a few dates and quick descriptions of some important wars and great kings and maybe some cultural changes, and you've got bare bones world history. Beware though, being consistent is almost as important as being organized. Your chronologies and events need to mesh. The goal is for your world to seem real, and you can't have realism when your history contradicts itself. It might be a pain at times.
That is the sound of ultimate suffering.
But it really is pretty important. It's a good idea to construct a timeline and add things to it as you build your history. That way you won't go to add a new king and find out that nation already had a healthy king at that point.
How does that follow?
One simple way is to make a text document and create a bullet point list of events plus the date they occurred. List the date first and then a short note about the event, like 1482, King Reginald VII ascends to the throne. You may find it helpful to color code events. Have a set of colors for different kinds of events, like red for wars, purple for new kings, green for the founding of cities, yellow for diplomatic interactions, blue for inventions or scientific breakthroughs, and so forth. Decide which category an event fits under and write the text in that color. This will help you sort out events as you look through your timeline. You could make a visual world timeline with a large roll of paper and a ruler.
Good idea.
In this picture, I have a 200-foot roll of easel paper or tax calculator paper with a line down the middle. Every so often, I have a mark representing a new decade. Each nation has a specific color, and I write events for each nation by drawing a horizontal line marking the duration of the event, or I just put a single line if it was a one-time thing. Events that don't belong to any nation in particular remain black. You can scale this timeline according to your own tastes, but I suggest making a decade mark every 5 inches. A 200-foot roll, or 2,400 inches, with a decade mark every 5 inches can fit 4,800 years of history on it. That's plenty of space for my purposes. Whatever timeline method you use, as you add events to it, you will want to go to the applicable section in one of your nation's text documents and add it. If there was a war in which the nation of Iridia invaded Syphilir, you would want to write a little bit about it under the subheading Offensive in your document on Iridia, and also write about it under the subheading Defensive in your document on Syphilir.
Under attack.
You'll need to focus on different points and write from a different perspective each time, but let's say Iridia fought a war with the wild barbarian horsemen within their borders. The war would only be recorded under the Offensive subheading in Iridia's document. What about the plebeian rebellion of Latium? That would go under the subheading Civil Wars in your document on Latium.
I can't help but notice you seem a little at war with yourself here.
You will find that some events don't fit in any of your documents. I would recommend adding a catch-all text document for miscellaneous pieces of world history that don't belong to any one nation. In any case, as you add historical events to any document, keep it chronological.
Start at the beginning.
Yeah. And when you come to the end, stop.
By now, you're probably thinking, this timeline idea and the other tips are all well and good, but what use is a timeline without history to add to it?
Yeah, just be patient.
We're getting there. Adding history is a lot easier when you're well prepared to record it. History will only bother to record things if they're important enough, and there's a limited number of really important things that can happen in a world. These can include, but are not limited to, wars, including rebellions and civil wars, reigns of kings, founding of important cities, discovery of new lands, international agreements, cultural and social revolutions, and scientific breakthroughs and inventions.
Open war is upon you, whether you would risk it or not.
In the nation document outline I showed you earlier, the section on wars will probably be one of the longest sections in the whole document, because it will contain at least a few sentences describing most of the armed conflicts in that nation's past. In most worlds, war is an essential and common thing. It can be more or less prevalent depending on a variety of factors, but look at our world history. The vast majority of most history books is dedicated to wars. And that's because war is one of the few things that is really important enough to make it into a history book. War can involve the deaths of tens of thousands of people, the destruction of lands, and the overturning of empires.
War isn't hell. War is war and hell is hell, and of the two, war is a lot worse.
How do you figure that, okay?
There are no innocent bystanders in hell. But war is chock full of them. Little kids, cripples, old ladies. In fact, except for a few of the brass, almost everybody involved is an innocent bystander.
Almost nothing else can have such drastic and horrible repercussions on so many people.
War. It's fantastic.
Is it any wonder war comprises the majority of most history books? Your timeline will contain an at-a-glance summary of the lives of the kings of the past.
Didn't know we had a king. I thought we were an autonomous collective.
And yes, you could substitute regent or president or governor or whatever when I say king, but you will want to include a little information about most of your former rulers. Ancient civilizations had king lists. They were basically detailed genealogies of the line of kings, plus accounts of their greatest exploits.
Is Horace in those books? No.
Then they bore me.
You're going to create something similar. I know that sounds scary and really, really boring, but
You have to be really careful not to fall asleep, right? Don't fall asleep now. Yeah, I'm watching you. Yeah, don't fall asleep. No, don't move. I'm watching you.
if you use the timeline paper roll method, you're going to end up having a series of lines for reigns of kings that hardly ever has a break in it. King follows king, usually leaving no time for anarchy. Once in a while, though, you'll have a gap, usually because the records of that king's rule have been lost. In a fantasy world, kings can come to the throne in a variety of ways. The most common is inheritance via a direct line of descent, but there's also usurpation, election by the people,
and then they made me their chief,
or sometimes selection by a deity or magical artifact.
Strange women lying in ponds, distributing swords is no basis for a system of government.
In your Rulers of the Past section, you'll want to write the names of your kings like a bullet point list. Write the name of the king, the years of his reign, and 1 or 2 sentences about notable things he did. For some kings, you don't have to put any information about their rule and just say they were a really dull, lazy king, or the records have been lost. It could look something like this.
This is hurting my brain on a number of levels.
You can have varying levels of detail too. There will always be filler kings who never did anything important and are just there to fill out the years. But you'll also have your Julius Caesars and Queen Victorias and Adolf Hitlers who had a really big impact on history. Their entries will naturally be a bit beefier. As a reference, the book of 2 Kings in the Bible is a really great example of what you're trying to do here. It has all the detail of a genealogy and historical chronicle, but it's kept from being too boring by containing good information about the lives of the rulers and stories about their deeds. The founding of an important city was a big deal for most ancient civilizations. The Roman system for recording years was for a long time based off of the founding of Rome, ab urbe condita, with its founding being year 1. If you include the founding of cities, most of them will be the capitals of the nation. This category could also include the moving of the nation's capital from one city to another. This happened quite frequently in ancient Chinese history. A king would decide the current capital was too vulnerable, so he'd move the seat of government to another spot somewhere safer. The discovery of a new chain of islands, or a new continent, or the first crossing of a mountain range, or the discovery of a new planet suitable for human life are all important things that merit a spot in your timeline. The discovery of new lands means room for expansion and new kingdoms, so these kinds of events are frequently followed by wars of conquest and the founding of new cities and nations, which in turn breeds a new line of kings. Or maybe an existing nation just grabbed up the land.
I hereby claim this land and all its inhabitants in the name of the Troll Nation.
Either way. Agreements between nations can be just as life-changing as wars.
Message for you, son.
They could be trade agreements, peace treaties, alliances, or any kind of diplomatic interaction.
And that's all I have to say about that.
A cultural revolution could be anything from a renaissance to a great awakening to a civil rights movement to women's suffrage to whatever. Maybe the nation abolished slavery, or maybe music became really popular, or maybe a bunch of rioters went on a statue smashing spree. Cultural revolution and social change don't always have to be for the better. Scientific breakthroughs can include the development of new weaponry, the discovery of microorganisms, creating the first slip-space wormhole, you name it. You'll want to limit yourself to only including really life-changing inventions. Don't add invention of the paperclip to your timeline. This kind of thing will probably be more common in futuristic worlds, but is by no means limited to a sci-fi setting.
Basically, what you're asking me to do is give you an industrial revolution.
Maybe one of your nations discovered how to smelt iron ore and work iron. That would give them an advantage over those nations that still use bronze. So now maybe a war of conquest follows this. The discovery of square rigging precedes a decisive naval battle. The use of the all-new longbow gives the victory to an outnumbered army. As I mentioned previously, a sad truth about humanity is that we tend to use our scientific breakthroughs and use them to wage war. You should reflect this in your timeline. Okay, finally, we get to talk about how to think of things to add to your world's lore. Sometimes coming up with stuff to add to your archives just takes a lot of sitting and thinking.
Think.
You'll find that a lot of my tips here are really more applicable to finding inspiration for stories, but that's what history is, stories of the past. Most of the tips here should be applicable to all 7 kinds of events we discussed earlier. I have 4 go-to sources for inspiration, whether for stories, history, lore, character development, anything. Any kind of creative writing can benefit from these sources. Read up on real-world history. Learn from our past and use the decisions and actions of our ancestors as a launchpad, whether it led to a glorious flight or a hideous crash. Right here, I have to give a shout out to the History of the World series by Susan Weiss Bauer. They're the most thorough, detailed, and entertaining history books I've ever read. It was there I learned that Ferdinand I of Austria, whose mother was also his double first cousin once removed, liked to pack himself into a wastepaper basket and roll down the hall, and his most coherent utterance was reportedly, "I am the emperor, I want dumplings."
I appear to be rolling out of control. All this rolling reminds me I have Rolos.
Read good books.
Reading is great for your mind.
Read the classics, you know, those hundreds of great old books which formed the cornerstone of classical Western education for thousands of years. There are good new books as well, but they're harder to find.
I'll borrow this one.
There's a reason the classics have endured for hundreds or thousands of years. People recognize quality, and quality gets preserved. Will Captain Underpants still be a familiar title 200 years from now? I doubt it. Choosing a good read from the piles of old literature can be daunting. If you need a place to start, please visit this link and click on the 1,000 Good Books list. This is a list of, unsurprisingly, 1,000 good books, organized by reading level and author. This list is an excellent place to start. Scan it until you find one that catches your eye and head to your local library.
I checked this out weeks ago for a bit of light reading.
Warning, this is for inspiration only. Taking the events, plot, characters, ideas, or words of another and repeating them verbatim or passing them off as your own is plagiarism and it is illegal.
You are a pirate!
Watch good movies. Not as good as the previous option in my opinion, but it's an okay alternative. One of my personal favorite sources of inspiration is listening to music. Video game soundtracks, film scores, and instrumental music make up the vast majority of the music I listen to frequently. It's an odd blend I call epic orchestral neoclassical fantasy soundtrack. I often find that lyrics distract me and dictate to me what I'm supposed to think about the music rather than letting my imagination be carried away by the composition. Plus, 98% of lyric music created in the past 70 years is about relationships and breakups, and that's not what I want to write about.
And baby, I'll be moving on, and I think it should be something I don't want to hold back.
I want to write about nobility, honor, courage, sacrifice, justice, integrity, perseverance, and heroism, so I listen to music that inspires that. I particularly love the works of Bruneville, Two Steps from Hell, Audio Machine, Hans Zimmer, Yasunori Mitsuda, and Jeremy Soule. I would love to share a selection of their work with you to get you intrigued, but we don't have time for that, so you'll just have to go check them out yourself. Alright, let's review. So far, we've seen how to format and write a booklet about each of your civilizations. We've seen how to make a map of your world, how to add interesting terrain, and how to decide what era to set your world in. We've seen how to found nations, build cities, and name important locations. We saw how to create your own language and religion, and we've looked at what kinds of things to add to your world's history, how to add it, and where to find inspiration for both historical events and many kinds of creative writing. In my opinion, the most important things to fully develop are the culture, lore, and history of your nations and world. Your geography can be sketchy, your map can be sloppy, and your language can consist of 8 words.
Pathetic.
But if you can have deeply immersive cultures and lore, then it will come alive. Just don't totally lose your audience in a pile of obscure references and names. Of course, the number one example I have cited continually is Middle-earth, but there are other immersive fictional universes in existence. As one example of a rich video game environment, look at the Elder Scrolls series. The immersive 3D world of the 5th installment, Skyrim, is paired with equally immersive mountains of behind-the-scenes lore, development, language building, writing, and history. The timeline and story development behind the Halo series is also quite complex and detailed. The numerous games, books, and videos released under that franchise have served to elaborate and expand that universe. But don't compare your efforts to these products. The first example was created after a dedicated genius spent a lifetime working at it. The other two were produced after years of work by teams of paid developers. So don't measure yourself by these standards, but by all means aim high. Well, after weeks or months or years of world building and filling your folders with extensive documents, you may decide to compile all your information into one master document. I suggest dividing it into 2 main parts, the world and the lands. Part 2 will be further divided into established nations and unsettled lands. Part 1 will contain all of your universal information that doesn't apply to any one nation. This will include your information on the universe, languages, religions, and world history, and maybe a quick overview of the nations. Part 2A will have all your nation info outlines, and Part 2B will have your documents on the unsettled areas. Think of developing your world like writing a novel. You can take creative writing classes that tell you how to structure your work and what to include and what to leave out and where to find inspiration, but ultimately the characters and events are up to your imagination alone. My video and the many other world building resources out there can give you tools and ideas, but not the final product. Go make a world, make it your own. Breathe your own ideas into it and bring it to life. Play with the inhabitants, the history, the cultures, and if you want to, tell a story with it. Go have fun and happy world building.